It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Alison Bateman-House, who comes to us from NYU Grossman School of Medicine, where she is an assistant professor in the Division of Medical Ethics. She's also a professor of practice in law at the University of Arizona, James E. Rogers College of Law. Thank you so much, Dr. Bateman-House.
Hi, everybody. I'm just trying to hide my controls so that I can see you more easily. Let me do that. There we go. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. And I'm really very excited, especially to follow Wendy's wonderful presentation, because there were so many things that I was like, wow, I just wish I had more time to be able to explain this in more detail. And I think you're going to see that we had very complimentary presentations. And also, I am not a physician. I'm not a pediatrician. I know nothing about hard science. So I'm going to be talking about disorders like spinal muscular atrophy, SMA, but I wasn't ever going to be able to explain to you what exactly it was or what its natural history was. So I'm so thankful she covered that already. I was charged with talking about the ethics of genetic therapies for neurodevelopmental disorders. And as you can see on the slide, one of the hats that I wear, sorry, there's an ambulance going outside. This is our Zoom reality at the moment. One of the hats that I wear is I co-chair a working group on pediatric gene therapy and medical ethics that's based out of NYU Langone Health. And so I tend to think a lot about gene therapies, these sort of virus-based interventions that we were just hearing about. But of course, there are also gene editing technologies. There's the ASO, antisense oligonucleotide drugs that we were just hearing about. And I tried to touch on all of them in this presentation so that I was really talking about genetic therapies writ large, not just pediatric gene therapies, but you will hear me every so often go back to pediatric gene therapies just because that's my comfort zone. So I want to put my disclosure slide up and let y'all look at that at your leisure while I make a few comments. But basically, I wanted to say, Wendy showed that really amazing graphic that showed all the commercial activity happening in the gene therapy space. And I have somehow carved out a niche of advising companies in that space. So there's detailed information at this URL on the screen, but I think you can safely assume that I've worked with probably half, if not more, of the companies that were listed on that screen. And again, it's not because I have any technical expertise. I think it's just because I tend to think of myself as a storyteller. And so companies tend to like hearing stories about what other people have done right or wrong as a way to think through what they want to do. You will note here, I wrote that I'm an unpaid consultant for NLORM, which is an entity Wendy just mentioned. That's a philanthropy that is funding these N of 1 opportunities that she talked about. And I also am an unpaid consultant for Biogen, which is the developer for Spinraza, that first ASO for SMA that she was talking about, and Direct Relief, which is a global charity that actually handles the Spinraza compassionate use program for countries in which the drug was never brought forth for licensing, but is made available through a charitable donation through Biogen. And the last thing I want to say about my disclosures is you can see I receive funding from both Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, which obviously has a vested interest in the topic I'm talking about here, and also Pfizer, which is developing a gene therapy for, hopefully developing a gene therapy for muscular dystrophy. So those are all my disclosures. And now let's get on to the topic at hand. So I was asked to talk about these therapies, and it was not specified as to whether I'm talking about them solely when they're investigational or after they are approved and being used as treatments. And so I took the liberty of saying I'm going to talk about both. And just to try to keep us all from getting confused at where in the development trajectory I'm talking at a particular point in time, if you see that lovely blue shade, I'm talking about something that's specific to investigational drugs. And I'll say that again as we go through the slide deck, just to try to keep myself abreast on what I'm talking about as well as you. And so I just want to say, when we're talking about investigational therapeutics, Obviously, we're dealing with a situation where there's less knowledge of the possible risk and benefits. This is not an approved product. We are still learning. It typically has been used in a very small number of individuals. And of course, there's less access. By design, our regulatory system limits the amount of people who can get access to a product before it has received marketing authorization, before it has received that FDA approval saying, yes, this product is safe and effective as a treatment for this particular indication in this particular patient population. So when I'm talking about investigational products, there's increased uncertainty and there's decreased access. And then when I'm talking about products when we're in the post-approval era, the phase, there's obviously more knowledge of possible risk and benefits. Doesn't mean there's complete knowledge. Obviously, we continue to learn about products after they receive FDA approval. In fact, every so often, drugs get pulled from market after being approved because post-market sort of surveillance turns up that, really the risk benefit ratio wasn't quite what was anticipated ahead of time as we get more exposure to the product in more people. And then of course, there's also more access, right? Because once it's available for marketing, it's available through normal commercial means. And I wrote in theory, because of course we know in the United States, there is not universal access to therapeutics, even of people who have the particular indication for which that therapeutic has been approved. And that's just a moral failing of our system. And of course, once you think globally, of course, inequities of access just continue. So I want to throw up right here down at the bottom just a couple points that I'm going to be hitting as I go along, which is that there's differential access sometimes between children and adults, or differential treatment and how this should be viewed in children and adults. And I'll talk about that a little bit. I already mentioned global disparities between what happens in the United States versus globally. I think it's really important to note, and again, we all know this is not novel, but there are individuals, there are populations who are advantaged with regard to access. They have the money, they have the time, they have the social wherewithal to be able to travel to get access to a specialist, or travel to get access to a clinical trial, or be able to change insurance plans in order to be able to get access to a drug that's not on one insurer's formulary. And then we have populations who, of course, do not have those advantages. And then last but not least, there are each different patient population, particularly with regard to its size, has a different economic situation. What we tend to be talking about in these genetic neuromuscular diseases are rare diseases, as opposed to a very common thing like some sort of cardiovascular high blood pressure or something. Not always, and also within rare, there's a spectrum between ultra rare and ultra rare, and then just plain old rare. But each of these sort of economics of an individual indication will have ramifications that I'm going to be talking about. So I just wanted to put flags in those, and we'll come back to that. So Wendy's already mentioned this, so I can go through this very briefly, which is just to say, before we start talking about ethical concerns about the therapies, we need to acknowledge that there are ethical concerns about who gets access, even to the diagnosis, and the specialist who is able to identify that this person would be the appropriate recipient for a therapy, or would be an appropriate candidate for a trial, or is someone that we would be treating with this therapy. And I just have a couple data points here to flesh this out more. So in the United States, there's increasing use of whole genome sequencing for children who have undiagnosed medical conditions. So these are children in which, perhaps they did the newborn screening, they didn't come up with any of the conditions that have been identified as being, as Wendy said, intervenable, and have received placement in that newborn screening, but there's something not there. They're not meeting their developmental milestones. There's failure to thrive. There's something. And at this point, you start doing the genetic workup to try to find out what's happening. Whole genome sequencing is increasingly available for kids in the United States. in intensive care unit settings. But what we have seen is until you are severe enough to get into the ICU, it's really quite segmented who is able to get access to this screening just through outpatient providers. And as you can imagine, some insurance companies are more willing to pay for it and many are not, and may actually have these sort of, intervening steps of, you have to try this less expensive test, which also is, perhaps less accurate or looks for less things before you can go to the more expensive test. That is just one data point, talking about who has access to specialists, where, for example, children's hospitals are located within the United States, driving distance to them, et cetera, I think makes the point that there's just inequities of access within the US, not to mention globally. And we have talked quite a bit thus far about SMA, and we're going to continue to do so, but I just pulled it out as again, a data point. So we talked about this newborn screening. Well, newborn screening is left to the states. It's not a federal initiative, at least not at this point. And the last time I checked, which was maybe about 4 months ago, 38 of 50 US states screen for SMA at birth. So we talked about how, this has up until now been the most common cause of death in children prior to the age of 2. We can now intervene, but only if you have the testing done at the appropriate time point. And so newborn screening is a life-saving intervention, but obviously not all states have chosen to implement it for SMA. And just to make this like as up to the date as humanly possible, I actually got a call earlier this week from a congressperson's office on Capitol Hill saying, wait a minute, I'm actually very concerned about this. This is a public health intervention that people do not consent for. Why are we taking blood from children without their parental consent? Is this not something that we should, sort of roll back the script on and say, we can only do this for people once they have parental consent? And I will let you think to yourself of the ramifications that would have. So this is still a very active area of questions and policy determination. Once you, go out from the United States to globally, this is a busy slide. I'm not going to read it, but I'm just talking about, inequities of access globally. So this is in that first line, whole exome sequencing. The second line is non-invasive prenatal testing. This is a BMJ Global Health article from 2021. And you can see that, where you live in the world obviously has implications for how available these sorts of screening tools are for you. Okay, so enough about that, because we did talk about that. So when we get into the actual therapeutics for these indications, I just want to note that there are inequities in what indications are the target of therapeutic development. Now, obviously, I mentioned earlier, some patient populations are larger than others. So there's a commercial incentive to specialize in certain, to focus on certain populations over others. But there's also, science. There's just some diseases where the target perhaps seems more amiable for intervention than something that seems more complicated. So I'm not casting stones and I'm not saying, oh, people are doing, bad things here. I'm simply saying we need to be aware that there is not equal progress across the board for all interventions. And so this is unpublished data from a study one of my students is doing, again, on pediatric gene therapy trials. So this is just a sliver of the research that's happening in this area. But you can see 11 trials for severe combined immunodeficiency versus a whole host of indications for which there is only one trial. And this is not just trials within the United States, this is trials globally. So you can see that there really are severe differences in the amount of research happening for some indications versus others. And here, even within one particular disease, here's an example. So this is Exondys 51. This is one of those ASOs that Wendy was talking about. And this one is approved by the FDA for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. But it is only for patients who have a specific mutation of the dystrophin gene. So not all Duchenne patients would be able to use this drug. It wouldn't work in some of them. And in fact, this particular type of Duchenne affects only about 13% of the population with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So if you look at Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which on the surface appears to be a success story. It actually has approved products for, an otherwise life-limiting, progressive, highly disabling disease. But these products are not available for all patients with the indication. And that just, indicates to us the importance of making sure we don't have, subpopulations within indications that get excluded and see progress being made for their peers, but not for themselves. Inequities in where investigational therapies are being studied. So you saw on that slide earlier, globally, when we did the research last year, there was only one trial for Canavan's disease listed in clinicaltrials.gov, and you can see where that one trial was located. So this is atypical. Do not think that this is the norm, and I'll explain that in a minute. But I'm just saying, think to yourself about the parent who's been diagnosed with a deadly disease, a rapidly progressive disease, knowing that there are no approved treatments for your child. Your only chance to intervene in the natural progression of the disease at all is to participate in a clinical trial. And the only clinical trial available to you is not in your country, perhaps not even in your continent. And you're going to have to figure out how to relocate there. Is that possible for most people? And I would say, chances are no. It's going to be a very small minority of people who are able to just uproot themselves and take advantage of these opportunities. Now, I said this was an outlier, not a standard, and so I want to show some numbers to back that up. This again is unpublished data from last year for pediatric gene therapies, but you can see the majority of trials are located in North America, and within North America, most of them are within the United States. And I am confident, even though I cannot give you the numbers, that holds true outside of just pediatric gene therapy. For gene therapy in general, for drug development in general, a lot of the research is centered in the United States. So those of us in the US are blessed with, disproportionately good access to these study sites, but even so, there's inequities within the United States. I always tend to pick on Wyoming. If you look at clinicaltrials.gov in terms of where trial sites are situated, there's fleetingly little available for any indication, whether it's cancer, whether it's whatever, in Wyoming versus where I'm in right now, Manhattan, New York City. Just opportunities abound. So inequities, geographic inequities. And of course, these geographic inequities have other ramifications. So here are some questions that I am always asking about access to investigational trial sites. So how often do the participants have to visit? And when they go, is it that they are there for a couple hours? Is it there for a couple days, a couple weeks? Does the trial site reimburse travel expenses? Does it help identify housing? Is it accessible for those with mobility impairments? So, particularly with neuromuscular disorders, if you have something where people lose mobility over time, but they're going to have to fly, planes are notorious for losing or injuring wheelchairs. And so, they're just difficulty compounded on top of difficulty, which result in, inequitable access to these opportunities. And then, of course, there's the question of what's the length of the trial itself and the length of follow-up. Some of you may not be aware that the FDA currently has recommended a 15-year follow-up for gene therapies. So just think about not only going in for an annual site visit for, say maybe a 3-year trial, but for 15 years thereafter, particularly if this is a sponsor that does not pay upfront for expenses, but either you're on your own to figure it out or they reimburse after the fact, potentially months later. Moving on, I mentioned earlier that if you see this blue, it means I'm talking about investigational products and clinical trials, but now I'm off of that and just say, these same questions can be asked about products once they're approved and say, does this treatment, is it something that you can use everywhere, or is it something that can only be used in certain locations that have specific, perhaps equipment or specific training? And Wendy mentioned earlier, some of these interventions have to be put in, perhaps surgically, perhaps you do an intrathecal injection into somebody under general anesthesia. as opposed to an IV injection, which is far less resource intensive and can be done in a much wider variety of locations. And so again, this is our unpublished data from pediatric gene therapy trials. But you can see, fortunately for this question of, sort of widespread access, a lot of the active research is in this in vitro, IV format, which I think is a good thing. But certain things are going to be more resource intensive. That's all there is to it. But it's just something to keep in mind when starting down the development pathway and trying to say, what is our goal here? Who's our population? Where do we want to be able to use this in the long run? Different nations have different regulatory and reimbursement frameworks. So even when you have a proven therapy, it's not going to be globally accessible. I mentioned earlier that I'm on a committee for Biogen that helps allocate humanitarian access to Spinraza in nations where they never sought marketing authorization. There was no financial incentive to seek marketing authorization in that country. And so rather than bringing it to market and having it available through commercial means, as is common in most of the world, it's just given out as a limited gift. And how is that done? This is an old slide, but I put it up here intentionally to show when Spinraza, this SMA treatment, the ASO, was coming out. You can see even in Europe, which we tend to think of, as perhaps it doesn't get drugs as quickly as the United States, but it tends to get them within months to a year after the United States. We tend to think of it as sort of this unitary block. You can see within Europe, there was a gross difference between those nations where there was no access at all versus there was partial access for some people in certain circumstances versus full access. And then you can just expand out from that from Europe to the world as a whole. And this was not unique to Spinraza. I want to emphasize that. This is what happens with all new novel products when they enter circulation. Value-based pricing. So Wendy mentioned that SMA does actually have now an approved gene therapy, which is, so amazing and so scientifically exciting. But it also costs $2.1 million for that one dose. And on one hand, people say, well, look, $2.1 million sounds like a lot, but if that's going to be a one and done drug, if we're not going to have to treat them again, then really maybe, that's a reasonable expense for something that is going to end up having such long-term ramifications in terms of preventing, need of other facilities, et cetera, et cetera. And I am by far not an economist, but I just want to say in listening groups with parents with SMA, what they have said is they're deeply concerned that if a payer or an insurer says, we're going to pay $2.1 million, your child is now cured and we're not paying for other things that we would not pay for, a child of that age, we're not giving you other services. Parents are deeply concerned about that and saying, perhaps my child did receive Zolgensma, this gene therapy, but they didn't get them from the day they were born. It wasn't delivered in utero, as we were talking about a minute ago. And my child still has needs. They might still need physical therapy. They might still need occupational therapy. They might need other things. And now I'm being denied coverage for those services because I'm being told you got the $2.1 million cure. So that's something that all of us, I think, need to be thinking about in terms of justifying the expense for these products and then saying, what is it that we're willing to let people have in addition to that versus not? Here's some questions. So what was studied in the clinical trials? And then how are clinicians, regulators, and payers willing to extrapolate those findings? So we know in clinical trials, you tend to have a very sort of, homogeneous sample that does not represent the larger patient population, but it's something that's picked to have a minimum of noise and be able to have your greatest chance of being able to, statistically prove that, yes, this intervention resulted in this outcome and it's not these other, things biasing the results. Well, then in the real world, even if, say, FDA says, okay, good, we're convinced, even though you had this very cherry-picked sample, we're willing to give a broad label. Anyone with this condition can use this drug. There's still going to be people making decisions about, well, am I really going to prescribe this to this patient because they don't look like the people who were in the trial? Or am I really going to pay for it for this patient because they don't look like the people who are in the trial? And I've got 3 quick case studies for that. So if you have a trial, again, for something like Duchenne muscular dystrophy, where loss of ambulation is a major hallmark of the disease, but the trial only had ambulatory patients, are you going to be in a situation where non-ambulatory patients are shut out of getting access to the product even after it's approved? Because, for example, insurance companies go, this is a really expensive drug. It wasn't tested in non-ambulatory patients. You need to go back and do another trial in non-ambulatory patients before I'm willing to pay for it for this patient. That's an example. SMA, the original SMA trials were done in the type 1 patient population, which is, showing onset of symptoms basically from birth and then likely to die within the first 2 years of life. And Wendy or others, if I got that wrong, please correct me during the Q&A, because I am, again, not a physician. But then there were type 2 and type 3 SMA patients who wanted to be able to use the product and whose requests were denied on the grounds that they were not in the clinical trials and they were not willing to extrapolate the data from these clinical trials in type 1 patients to type 2 and type 3 patients. Those trials are now actually being done. Data is coming forward, but it's something that potentially could have been foreseen up front and acted upon, and it was not. So that's something to keep in mind as new drugs are being investigated. And then now, as we heard, SMA has been this marvelous success story. We went from having nothing to now having multiple approved drugs. But the question is, we still have clinical trials in which monotherapy is being used. And in the real world, if you can get access to, say, Zolgensma, the gene therapy product, and Spinraza, the ASO drug that is used every few months, some people may be more interested in doing that, saying, we don't know the durability of Zolgensma. We don't know the durability of its effect. At some point, in theory, it could wane, and I want to take this drug in addition to make sure that I, don't have any fall off the cliff effects that could be avoided. We don't have clinical trials researching that type of thing. I'm going to hit this part real quick because I think this audience knows it so well, but it's just, whether we're talking about research or treatment, we have informed consent issues, which means that the people making the decisions, whether it's the patient or their surrogate decision maker, have to have all relevant information, and that they have to have time to digest it and to be able to ask questions about it and seek input from others. There's nothing new about what I'm saying here, but what I want to point out is we know that the stakes are higher when it comes to these genetic interventions in terms of people really understanding what it is that they may or may not be able to do for them and what the implications of taking them are. I want to flag here just the question of medical literacy, just as sort of a background topic, and then we'll talk about it with regard to these genetic therapies in just one second. But it's estimated that 90 million Americans have what's considered low health literacy. And I always give as an example of this little vignette that I found somewhere. Visiting a clinic after being discharged from a hospitalization, Sherry says she was hospitalized due to, quote, a bad cold. Her medical chart shows she was admitted for pneumonia, complicated by diabetes and congestive heart failure. So if Sherry thinks she had a bad cold and now she has been discharged, her action plan going forward is probably quite different from if she understands that she didn't have an acute situation that has now resolved, but rather she has chronic diseases that will need to be monitored over time. And so this obviously has implications when people start thinking about participating in research or using relatively new products. And we also are in a situation where there's quite a lot of hype, be it intentional or unintentional, about these new novel interventions. So, here's a sort of sarcastic headline: "New wonder drug cures all illness in mice." And I'm sure you've seen these articles as much as I have, where you really have to get, like 5 paragraphs in or 6 paragraphs in or to the second page until you realize that this thing being touted as the cure for X has only been tested in mice, not in humans at all. Or if it was tested in humans, it was in a dosage finding study, not an actual therapeutic test of efficacy, et cetera. So there's a lot of hype, and particularly when you're dealing with unmet needs, unmet dire needs of the sort of diseases that we tend to be talking about when we're talking about, these rare genetic neuromuscular diseases without, available really sort of transformational therapies at this point in time. People can be very susceptible to buying into hype that is unfounded. And I just want to note on that aspect, there's been a sustained critique even about the term of gene therapy, in terms of saying it sort of gives people this preconceived idea that this thing is going to be therapeutic, even if it's an investigational product and we don't know it's going to be therapeutic, or even if it only has a very minor impact and not something that necessarily would be desired if someone truly understood what it is that this intervention is able to offer, particularly, given whatever side effects or cost or whatever is going to come along with its use. And I just want to give you one example of how this understanding of science can really haunt a situation. This is, some of you are probably familiar with this, a famous 60 Minutes episode back in 2019, talking about a trial targeting sickle cell. This is a gene therapy trial for sickle cell. And I actually have a segment from the transcript here. So the doctor, this is fancy genetic tinkering, and it involves putting different kinds of genes inside of you that you don't normally have. And this is the patient who's being profiled, the trial participant. Right. Doctor, does that give you any pause? Participant, I was terrified at first. I think they were using the HIV virus just because it spread so well. Doctor, right, a weakened HIV virus. Participant, right, of course. Now, this apparently, what people picked up from this is that there was research being done using the HIV virus. And there was a massive effort to try to, clarify very quickly, this is, like sort of the viral, the shell of the virus, the HIV causing part has been removed, something else has been put in it. You cannot get HIV from this intervention, et cetera. But it is just a real life example of how, if people don't understand the basics of gene therapy, it's very easy and very understandable that there would be misperceptions, and that those misperceptions can have real life implications, both for people's willingness to participate in a particular study and for their just sort of faith in research and science overall. This is not even talking about, the difficulty of trying to explain things to children or other patients without competency. And I always just like to throw this picture here. This is from a book intended to explain clinical trials to children with diabetes, and trying to explain what a randomized, blinded trial is. There are really clever and innovative ways out there that people have been trying to tackle the how do you educate people about research? How do you educate people about novel interventions in a way that is understandable and really meets them where they are at? But I would have to say, at least in my experience, it is the minority of research trials that actually really, successfully use such interventions, as opposed to interventions that are not as useful on that education slash, making sure we have truly informed consent or informed assent front. And particularly, when it comes to neuromuscular diseases, if you have a condition that really does affect the brain, it may be that you're not going to be able to get even assent from the participant or the patient, and you're really going to have to rely on that surrogate decision maker to make a decision in their best interest. Just to remind everyone, informed consent is a process, not a document, and there are lots of really clever things that have been tested out there. We could have a whole nother seminar on them, in terms of, how do you test people's comprehension to make sure they understand what you were saying about, either an approved product or an investigational product. Is there a role for a patient advocate in order to help with this decision-making process? And one thing I wanted to flag, and again, I do work a lot with pediatrics, so this is where this is coming from, is I have seen so many parents express fear that if they don't try an intervention, regardless of what the opportunity costs are, the logistical difficulties, the financial difficulties, the risk benefit ratio, if they don't try, they will be perceived as being a bad parent, because a good parent does anything they can to help their child, even when it creates, strain and stress for both themselves, their child, and the entire family unit. So I do think that that's an active area in which we as a community really need to have some sustained attention. I had planned on talking about special issues about, how do we educate people about the fact that once you edit someone's genome, you cannot undo that. It's not like a drug that you can halt because it's having undesirable side effects, but Wendy talked about that beautifully, so I don't feel the need to say that any more than what I just said. Special issues about interventions that are currently one-time only. There was a study done on ocular gene therapy where they were testing to see how well the participants, and these were adult participants, their partners, wives, spouses, et cetera, understood what was happening. And what they found is that even after what was really viewed by all parties as a good and useful and robust informed consent process, after they received the viral-based intervention, only then did they realize that that meant that they would not be eligible to get future gene therapies using that same viral vector. And that obviously is something that we really need people to understand up front, because they may choose to say, look, yes, weighing my options, whereas I would like to intervene in my condition, I want to wait until there's more known about this so I can make sure that I am doing something that we know is going to be safe and effective, as opposed to taking on that heightened uncertainty because I only get one shot at this. And this really gets into this question of risk-benefit balancing. For that point, I want to just note that there is an article that came out a few months ago that is just a fabulous article for anyone who's thinking about this. It's from a group at NIH. You can see lots of names that you would recognize there. But this article in Genetics in Medicine really deals with some of the thorniest of issues in this area, particularly for research, and I wrote them down at the bottom. So when is there enough preclinical evidence to commence clinical trials? As particularly where you have a devastating disease in which there's rapid progression leading to death, you have a lot of pressure, as Wendy was hinting, to just be like, intervene now. Like, we know the target, we think we have a reasonable approach, let's just do it. And so, this real question of at what point do we say, yes, we're comfortable starting the clinical trials, versus at what point do we say, ethically, we just cannot. How should risk and benefits be balanced in dose selection? Remember, if it's an only one-time intervention, you're probably going to want to go for a higher dose, as opposed to being willing to do this sort of incremental stepwise of saying, well, let's start a little low just for safety's sake. You're going to say, well, I want you to start a little bit higher because I want to maximize my chance of potentially benefiting from this intervention. So that question of dose selection is hugely important in this area. Should trials target earlier or later stage patients? Wendy talked about how oftentimes there's a window for intervention and you really need to come in early. But remember, early decreases the ability of that individual to actually be able to meaningfully participate in that decision. So do we say, look, particularly when there's high uncertainty, we really want to prioritize people who can make decisions, like Jesse Gelsinger, to participate in hazardous potentially hazardous, potentially risky interventions, even though we think it is less likely to result in a beneficial outcome for them, but they were able to make a more informed decision? Or do we say, we're going to go for surrogate decision makers instead and intervene, at a point where we think it's more likely to have a real impact or chance of beneficial effect? And then this question of, when there's a disagreement about any of these issues between the investigators or the IRB or the FDA and the patient community, how do you navigate those? So in closing, I just wanted to say, I showed you this earlier and said that I had this, I wanted to talk about gene therapies, both questions, ethical questions that come up in the developmental realm, as well as the post-regulatory approval realm. And I said, there's this little asterisk that I'm putting here. And the reason that I wanted to put that asterisk is to say, and Wendy has already hit this, so I thank her for that, that we are now seeing this rise of what is called N of 1 interventions. So these are interventions that are never going to receive FDA approval. There is no patient population. There is no economics driving any commercial entity to bring this product to market. And just to be honest, our drug development regime is a commercially motivated enterprise. It's very few entities that bring a drug to regulatory approval with no intention to ever market them. So we have this, what I prefer to call them, N of too small to be commercially viable situation, in which we have a genetic diagnosis. We can say we think it is this gene, we think it is, this mutation. We know enough about what this particular genetic mutation does to be able to anticipate what the natural history of this is going to be in a patient. And we think that we can innovate, whether it's an ASO or something else, a potential therapy, but we're never going to do this as a clinical trial because there's just no population. We're going to do this for one patient, or maybe, a handful of patients, 5 patients. And how do we take that sort of square peg and put it into our current regulatory framework, which says, if it's investigational, it needs to be treated as a clinical trial. It goes through this process. It goes through this amount of preclinical screening in 2 animal models, et cetera, versus situations in which that is just not feasible or frankly, even really necessary. And just to give FDA credit, FDA has been working very hard on trying to figure out a pathway for these N of too small to be commercially viable products to be tested. As Wendy said, Alison at Boston Children's Hospital was the first one of these to really make headlines. There's been some of this at Columbia. A few other institutions in North America have done this. And just from the ethics point of view, this raises 2 questions that are totally open-ended at this point. One is obviously the justice question of when it takes, over $1 million to develop one of these, who pays for that? I mentioned earlier that I'm an unpaid consultant for In Lorem, which is a philanthropy in this area. So obviously there's a role for philanthropy, but is that what we're going to do? Is we're going to say for the entire world, if you have one of these genetic mutations that is too rare for a drug to be developed and brought to market for you, you're going to have to find a charitable donor who's willing to pay for you? Or is there some other thing that we can do other than putting this on the backs of the patients and say, you have to go fundraise for yourself?
Sorry, Alison, I'm really sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure that we have time for a couple of questions.
So this is my last slide, and
okay.
I'm sorry, my timer must be off. I thought I had another minute, but the last thing I'll say is just balancing the individual and societal concerns, because again, when we're making decisions for one patient, we do make decisions for that one patient, but it's going to have implications for all those other N of 1s. And so we need to be appraised of that. So in conclusion, few very one-size-fits-all specific recommendations, but ongoing need to assess understanding, ameliorate misgivings, and tons of concerns about equity. So I'm done, and I'm happy to take your questions. And I'm
Thanks
sorry I
so
went
much.
over. My timer must have been off. I'm sorry.
We meant to include 15 minutes for discussion, so. But that was a really great talk, and I really appreciate your being here. We do have a couple minutes for discussion. We have one question in the chat. How does a geographical map of available clinical trials compare to where the disease is most prevalent?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so if you look at something like thalassemia or sickle cell, in which we know that it is more common in, say, you know, sort of like that Mediterranean, North African sort of band around the globe, you note that there's almost no gene therapy trials in that area. Of course, gene therapies are not the only type of drug products that are out there. So we'd have to do more research to answer that 100%. But I would say very much that things are being tested in predominantly the United States,
Yeah.
regardless of where we see that disease, you know, happen naturally.
And we had a comment from Linda Marikel. Linda, do you want to make your comment, or should I do it for you?
It was just, when you talk about people running into the limits of their insurance policies, and then they can't get post-rehab care because they have no finances and they've already been bankrupted by their ICU stays. So I think this is a problem that's across medicine, and it's going to be only accentuated with the genetic therapies.
Yeah.
So that's just, do you have a comment about insurance coverages?
Yeah, so I mean, absolutely not at all unique. It's just that in gene therapies, we're seeing price tags unlike what we've seen in other therapies. So it's going to be exacerbated, as you said.
Other comments? We will have time at the end for all of our speakers to be together in a panel discussion, and we can have more comments then. I see no other hands raised at the moment.
All right, well, thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions during the panel.
Thanks so much, Allison. And we will take now a 15-minute break.